it's always a great pleasure to actually introduce Jane because we do have history together. She was my PhD supervisor, and there are a few others. I know she looks about 32. It is also a supervisor from some other members of staff here, it was really nice to have an experience to work with Jane because we share similar interests, and at the time when I was doing her PhD, she was writing this book on art and architecture, which I really like very much, and I suggest anybody interested in the subject to look at that. But Jane's methodology and work precedes that book, obviously. I mean, her own PhD was embedded in the book Pursuit of Pleasure, which is about the 19th century sort of perception of women from a male perspective and critique of that, with a particular feminist slant. Jane works between art and architecture, feminist philosophy, a sort of critical theory. She has actually invented a new concept called critical spatial practice through her books on also science writing, and the current book is about the psychoanalysis and architecture. Of course, I'm going to forget half of the books, but I know there is one called Unknown City, and there is numerous articles of Jane's, both on the website or anywhere else in the book. So please welcome Jane. My great pleasure to you.
Well, thank you very much for coming along. Thank you for the delicious cake, which I'm just going to go back and carry on eating. And it's very nice to be here. Thank you, Yvonne, for inviting me. I was offered the opportunity of sitting at the back to read my paper, facing the images. And actually, as I think you might see through some of the things I'm going to talk about, I think that's going to be the best place for me to be. So I'll come back to the front after I've finished, and then we can have a talk together. But I hope it's okay if I sit at the back and you just hear my voice for this session. So the talk that I'm going to give this evening is actually kind of woven of 3 different parts, and it's not necessarily going to make perfect sense to you as we go along. One part, let me just get the slides, is charts some ideas around what are called transitional objects and spaces in psychoanalysis. I'm not sure how many of you have read or thought about psychoanalysis. It might sound a bit daunting or potentially not very interesting, but I hope to tempt you slightly into that territory. That part will be slightly more theoretical, so you may need to zone out depending on how interested you are in theory. Another strand, a second strand, is located in architectural analysis, specifically in architectural history, and it looks at some buildings that have been described as transitional structures, starting with a building in Moscow from 1928, moving to Corb's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille from 1947 to 1952, and then ending with some buildings that were built by the London County Council as part of the welfare state housing programme directly after World War II, so in the late 40s and into the 50s. And in a way, that part of it also engages with what's happening now. Some of you may have been reading about it. I don't know how it affects you living here in Brighton, but there's for sure a housing crisis in London right now. And that means that younger people, poorer people, middle class professionals, teachers, nurses and so on, are finding it increasingly difficult to stay in London because of the cost of housing. And one of the reasons is that large social housing projects from the post-war period, which I'm going to show as I go along, are being demolished. People are being evicted, whether they own their homes there or not, and they're being replaced by housing developments for the very rich, and mainly people from outside London, outside the UK, who are just buying them as ways of investing and increasing profit on their capital. And then the third strand is much more autobiographical, and it actually tells a story around some of these post-war buildings. Yvonne has already given me a very lovely introduction to my work, So I do want to say a couple of introductory things about my methodology before we begin. So I think the sight writing work that I've been developing, this kind of approach to writing that I call sight writing, is an attempt to think about the situatedness of the writer. So I think hopefully that might apply to all of you in any essays that you're doing, to think about the situated nature of what you're writing, where you're writing from, not just physically, but also politically or emotionally. And the first time I tried to do this was in the book that Ivana mentioned that came out of my PhD, called The Pursuit of Pleasure, which looked at a number of different spaces in London from the 1820s connected with a practice of rambling, where men moved through the city, basically gaining pleasure through dancing, drinking, going to sort of working class taverns or upper class assembly rooms. The working class ones on the left, the assembly room is very sort of top society, was on the right, and experiencing kind of the differences of the city. And in a way, the situatedness for me there was thinking about the specific sites that these ramblers visited, but also the site of my own writing, which was coming at it from a feminist perspective. I'm not going to say too much about that now. That moved on to thinking more about spatial practices. Certainly the rambling was a form of spatial practice in 1820s London, but I became more interested. I started teaching at Chelsea College of Art on a master's course and bachelor's course in public art. So I became very interested in site-specific practice, and I was particularly interested in how site-specific works that kind of intervened into urban spaces were somehow located between art and architecture. And the ones that I found were being kind of critical of the sites that they were located in, I started to call critical spatial practices. Through that, I also started to think about how, as a critic, when you write about a piece of architecture or an artwork, and I think that would apply to you as well, as students and architects, thinking about other people's buildings, ones that you're interested in, or parts of the city, histories that you're writing, you're always located to them in a particular way. And so that made me think much more about writing as a particular kind of practice. That, a bit like design, is a spatialised practice, different ways of doing things, different materialities to drawings and drawing tools. Writing too is something that is spatialised and material. So I started exploring different ways that writing might kind of leave the page or operate in something that we might call an expanded field, and start to take on different kinds of spatial forms. This was one project that related some spaces of writing in a book that talked about stories to do with thresholds, to a window installation piece. It was a sort of two-part work, located both in a window, and then coming out of that, kind of shadows were created and distortions. I became really interested in the unaffected the unintended effects of installation works as well, and the unintended effects of pieces of writing too, things that you don't plan in advance but kind of happen along the way. I also think that probably my approach to writing, and I imagine this might be the same for you as well, was definitely influenced by my training in architecture, and the fact that in architecture one always has to respond to a brief in some way, and that those responses to briefs can be both practical, but they could also be quite poetic, quite intuitive, quite emotional, quite dreamy. And some of the ways that I started to think about how to respond to artworks, this was a piece of a sight writing that I did in response to a piece of artwork by an artist called Alina Brotherus, and a triptych she produced of 3 photographs. And I was very interested in writing dreams and memories that were associated with her work, and made it into a kind of gallery installation piece. I'm just going through these quite fast to just give a flavour of some other kinds of projects that I've done. This was Alina's original work that kind of inspired me. And then I suppose I've also been interested in the possibilities for writing to take on material qualities, like what's a fold in writing? How can you fold things in writing? This was a piece, another installation piece that combined a covering over of objects within a church space. That one wasn't put through. And a folded text. I was very interested in folds of sheets, unfolding and unfolding linen, and also I made a folded piece of writing that I did as a kind of performative installation in the gallery, folding and unfolding and reading different parts that came out of that. So, sorry, this is quite a lively little device here. Okay, so this piece of writing that I'm going to talk you through now is actually woven of the three strands that I described, so psychoanalysis, architecture and sight writing. And I'm just going to begin with a quote from Frederick Jameson as a way of kind of guiding us through the text. He writes, some of you may know his work, as a cultural literary critic originally and then became a cultural and political theorist. He said, "It's in detecting the traces of that uninterrupted narrative, in restoring to the surface of the text that repressed and buried reality of this fundamental history, that the doctrine of a political unconscious finds its function and its necessity." In the talk, I'm going to suggest that architecture's political unconscious can be explored through these three sites. The psychoanalytic setting, this is an image of Freud's consulting rooms, which are known in psychoanalysis as the setting, the space where the analysts and analysand meet each other is called the setting. Architecture's social condenser, which I'll come back to, and the practice of sight writing. In Jameson's terms, the political unconscious calls for a form of literary criticism that explores the tensions of class struggle. If the unconscious is able to play a political role in producing a reading of a literary text that brings class struggle to the surface, what might be the possibilities and processes of a form of criticism that would allow for a political unconscious to emerge in architecture? So it's an open question. I'm not even sure I know what a political unconscious is. Perhaps we can talk about that afterwards, but it's something I'm very keen to explore. So, finally, to begin, May morn. The house is beautiful, a one-storey building with a square plan, born at the birth of modernism in the aftermath of the First World War. It embodies the values of early English modernism, of the arts and crafts movement, truth to materials and honest craftsmanship. From the road it looks a little unloved, in need of some care and attention, and up close it's clearly derelict, almost in ruins. We enter a room with windows at each end. Curtains are falling away from the runners. The fabric has been soaked overnight and is drying in the spring afternoon sunshine. On the windowsill and spilling over onto the floor are piles of old magazines. The pages are stuck together and disintegrate if you try to pull them apart. There are some photographs of buildings. One is particularly damp. The corners are soft and the surface is wrinkled. It shows a tower block, just completed, empty and pristine. A moss-green utopia, the modernist dream dispersing as it soaks up spring rain. Note, the captions to these photographs are taken from a text originally titled Moss Green, written as one in a series of three, contained within a critical essay on the work of Alina Brotherus and published as Longing for the Lightness of Spring. So this is the beginning of the second strand, so I've kind of coloured each strand differently so that you can try and keep track of the weaving between them. The lost object. The psychoanalytic concept of the lost object is introduced in the work of Sigmund Freud in relation to two stages of loss. First, the loss of the mother's breast, and then her whole person. Freud defines mourning as a reaction to the loss of a loved person or ideal. But he notes that while there is nothing about mourning which is unconscious, melancholia is some way related to an object loss which is withdrawn from consciousness. So he's trying to argue that mourning is something kind of perfectly normal, if you like, that we all go through when losing a loved person, but that melancholia, which was a term used in the last century, is something more pathological, something more difficult to deal with. And in fact today we would probably describe melancholia in terms of depression. He says, in melancholia, the relation to the object, so that's the lost object, the lost person, is no simple one. It's complicated by the conflict due to ambivalence. In melancholia, accordingly, countless separate struggles are carried on over the object in which hate and love contend with each other. The location of these separate struggles cannot be assigned to any system but the unconscious, the region of the memory traces of things as contrasted with word cathexes. So something that he looks at a lot is to do with memory traces, which he thinks occur in the voice actually as well as in things. And the previous slide shows a sort of drawing that he did quite early on to try and look at these issues. So he was very keen to try and draw unconscious and psychic conditions like melancholia or like depression, but whether or not they're readable or successful is part of a much bigger project. The Narkomfin communal house in Moscow, which was built between 1928 and 1929, linked to the idea or the concept of the social condenser. This was developed through the theoretical and then the practical work of the Russian constructivists in the 1920s. The artist Alexei Gan, who was a constructivist, had argued the capitalist towns as staunch allies of counter-revolution, and the architectural historian Catherine Cook, who studied constructivism in great detail, describes Gan's belief that the existing design of cities did not allow the social form of the revolution to flourish. She goes on to suggest a logical implication, that if one were to design the right kind of space, this would promote the new kind of society. She says, if a misfitting environment can obstruct social change, then a fitting one can foster it. If spatial organisation can be a negative catalyst, it can also be a positive one. She discusses how the notion of the social condenser, which was invented and then promoted by the constructivists, had to be actively revolutionary, and according to its subsequent development by the architect and theorist Mossai Ginsberg, it had to work materially. Low voltage activity and a weak consciousness would be focused through the circuits of these social condensers into high voltage catalysts of change in the habits and attitudes of the mass population. So this was a really key idea in the early period of the Russian Revolution, so in the early 20s, before Stalinism, which came through in the 30s. And a lot of people who were involved in it, particularly artists and architects, were trying to find forms of architecture that could promote revolutionary activities. And we now tend to think of that way of thinking as a form of what we'd call architectural determinism, that if you design a building a certain way, certain things will come out of it. I suppose it's also part of functionalism in architecture. But I think Catherine Cook's word, the word she uses is foster. So she suggests that the right kind of environment might foster something rather than determine it. So I think for me this period in history is a very interesting one for thinking about the relationship between social relations and architectural forms. The constructivist design methodology was developed in the designs for apartment types by the Russian Building Committee, and they came up with 6 different building types or apartment types, A to F, and they realised them in a number of schemes, specifically 6 schemes, and the Narkomfin communal house was one of these 6. So it's a kind of prototype scheme for a social condenser. The ethnographer Victor Buchli has done an in-detail study of the Narkomfin, and this means spending a long time there. I think ethnography is very important for architectural work. Spending a long time there, talking to people who live there now. These are contemporary photos that I've taken there, but Victor's book I would recommend to anyone interested in this. Trying to understand the importance of the Narcomphin, that what it was trying to do was generate what was seen at the time as a new socialist daily life or form of domesticity for architectural designers in the period. So we're trying to do quite radical things, really, which was to reduce domestic labour for the housewife. So they were, you know, feminist, early feminists, and to try and think of ways that people would have kind of more time for devoting to kind of socialist life rather than the sort of drudgery of domesticity. He describes how the OSA, which was the Union of Contemporary Architects, headed by the architect of the Narcomphin, Ginsberg, sought to address this issue of creating a new daily life by creating an entirely new rationalised architecture and material culture that were based on communist theories of industrialised production and consumption, guided by socialist ethics. So obviously up to this point, Russia had been quite imperialist. It was, you know, so the revolution was trying to start afresh in some ways. Victor Boucley discusses how the original design for the Narcomphin included 4 separate buildings, a living block with 3 different types of living unit that followed these particular guidelines, and dormitory units, a communal block with a kitchen, dining room, gymnasium and library, a mechanical laundry and a communal creche, which was never built. He explains that the Narcomphin was a social condenser of the transitional type, and this meant that the accommodation allowed for both pre-existing bourgeois living patterns, and they would be in units that included their own kitchens and living rooms, so quite conventional ones, but also, there were a number of different versions of this, but also something called the F unit, which was a fully communist unit. And the main distinction was that the former had kitchens and family hearth, whereas the F unit, the fully communist unit, was a sleeping unit with minimal facilities for preparing food, since cooking and eating were all to take place in the communal block. You might be kind of imagining what that might be like to live in. Boucley stresses that the variety of having these different kinds of unit types wasn't an expression of choice necessarily or tolerance, but it was actually a reflection of the belief that architecture had this transformative power, that it was capable, and he uses the word inducing rather than fostering, inducing a particular form of social organisation. The intention was that the building would help those following bourgeois living patterns to become socialist. The Narcomphin communal house was not designed as a fully fledged commune, but as a social condenser of the transitional type. So there were quite extreme versions of the commune at this time, where people had just a room, as you would in a very small kind of hotel, and everything else, including all childcare, children's meals, went on in separate blocks. But this was a transitional unit where you would start off as a family and then start to become more communal, move out of being a nuclear family unit and perhaps use your F unit just for sleeping in, and take all your meals, laundry, etc. in all the communal spaces. Okay, so returning to the site writing strand, this is the second iteration of the three-way plat, if you like. Longing for the lightness of spring. In 2001, the curator Jules Wright from the Wapping Project invited me to write an essay about Elena Brothers's work, Spring. Spring was composed of 2 installations, a video triptych, Rain, the Oak Forest Flood, which was located in the Boiler House, and a backlit image called Untitled, which was 3 metres by 8 metres, reflected in the water tank on the roof of Wapping. Untitled showed an illuminated horizon dividing sky from earth, the pale grey sky of Iceland floating above what was once viscous lava, now covered in moss green. Projected onto screens hung from the ceiling The video triptych, Rain, Oak Forest and Flood, would comprise 3 different temporal moments. In the first video, the viewer, located on the inside of a window, watches as rain streams down on the outside of the glass. In the second, there is an oak forest, after the rain has stopped, but when drops, still heavy, continue to fall to the ground, what the poet John Betjeman has called second rain. And then the third video shows a flood. A forest of elegant trees rise silver from a pane of shining water. In responding to Elena's work, I found myself returning to scenes from my own life, dreamed and also remembered, that corresponded with Brotherus's images and supplemented her landscapes with places of my own. Moss Green. It's a beautiful house, a 1-storey building with a square plan, born at the birth of modernism in the aftermath of the First World War. It embodies the values of early English modernism, of the arts and crafts movement, truth to materials and honest craftsmanship. From the road it looks a little unloved, in need of some care and attention. Up close it's clearly derelict, almost in ruins. We enter a room with windows at each end. Curtains are falling away from the runners. The fabric has been soaked overnight and is drying in the spring afternoon sunshine. On the windowsill and spilling over onto the floor are piles of old magazines. The pages are stuck together and disintegrate if you try to pull them apart. There are some photographs of buildings. One is particularly damp. The corners are soft, the surface is wrinkled. It shows a tower block just completed, empty and pristine. A moss green utopia, the modernist dream dispersing as it soaks up spring rain. White linen. I dreamt of the house last night, my mother's house in Cwmgwrs, South Wales, a place where it always rained in the holidays, and that as a girl I rather resented. But now, as it's being taken away from me, I already begin to miss. I was in the dining room. The rest of the house was empty except this one room. The furniture was far too big and covered in linen. The air was thick and still, and with the curtains drawn it was very dark, but the linen glowed white. I went towards the mantelpiece to take a look at myself in the mirror, and I saw for the first time in the reflection that the room was full of plants, so alive I could smell moisture still on their leaves. Bittersweet. In Palafrugell, a small town north of Barcelona on the Costa Brava, is a derelict cork factory with a clock tower in front. The clock tower is a handsome structure, elegant and robust, but the clock on top has stopped. The floor is covered in dust and pieces of furniture, lampstands, chairs, old printing machinery. There are words everywhere, scattered all over the floor. Burnt orange, turquoise, black, white, bittersweet. We stay in the factory a long time. We don't speak, just walk and look. And later, once we've left the building, he brings something to show me. It's a white sign with carefully painted black letters. Bittersweet. The 3 places I described tried to make spatial, material and visual associations with Elena Brotherus's spring. In Moss Green I remembered a derelict house in the Greenbelt where in spring we found photographs of a brave new world of modernist high-rise housing. Just after the autumn equinox, after her death, I dreamt of the shrouded home of my Welsh great-aunt. White linen recalled the presence of life in the forms of plants in this dream, while bittersweet recalled another spring visit, this time to an abandoned cork factory in Catalonia, where we found the names of colours scattered, abandoned, all over the floor. Anticipating the end of winter, spring opened in Wapping just after the autumn equinox in the northern hemisphere. So curatorially, the work faced towards the long decline into winter, the season from which it desired to turn away. Paralleling this juxtaposition which poised spring's hope for winter's retreat right at its early edge, I positioned spring's foregrounding of anticipation as a yearning that looks forward to new life against my own fascination with the backwards gaze of nostalgia. My three scenes, moss green, white linen and bittersweet, connected Elena Brothers's landscapes infused with anticipatory longing of spring to places tinted by nostalgia, trying to construct some kind of tension between life and death, rejuvenation and decay, a looking forward and a turning backward. So I think it's also probably, I'm sure it will be apparent to you, but spring and autumn, the equinoxes are also kind of transitional seasons. And I suppose thinking about this work called Spring that had been curated at the autumn equinox also made me think about time-specific curation rather than site-specific curation, what it means to make a work at a particular moment of time or a season or a time in one's life even. The transitional object, or the object of the first relation. The theory of object relations was created by the independent British analysts, and it describes the unconscious relation that exists between a subject and his or her objects. These objects can be internal and external. The child psychiatrist and also psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott introduced the idea of a transitional object that was related to but distinct from the external object of the mother's breast and the internal object, the introjected or imagined breast. So the material breast in the outside world and the child's kind of imagination and desire for the breast. For Winnicott, the transitional object, or the original not me possession, stands for this first object of the breast, but the use of symbolism implies the child's ability to make a distinction between fantasy and fact, between internal and external realities. This ability to keep inner and outer realities separate yet interrelated results in an intermediate area of experience, what Winnicott calls potential space. And he thinks that this contributes to cultural experiences around both religion and art. He thinks of cultural experiences located in this potential space between the individual and the environment. I think this is a very important idea for design, really, and also, for the design of spaces. This idea of the spaces that exist physically in the world, but those that are simultaneously kind of interpreted internally and that we imagine internally, and how we manage to hold those worlds apart and yet together. I have located, this is Winnicott writing, I've located this important area of experience in the potential space between the individual and the environment, that which initially joins and separates the baby and the mother, when the mother's love, displayed as human reliability, does in fact give the baby a sense of trust or confidence in the environmental factor. So Winnicott also saw the mother as a kind of environment, in a way the first environment, and how he had this concept of the good enough mother, which I think again is quite important for design. So someone who doesn't determine what will happen for the baby, but gives them good enough support for them to be kind of self-determining, or to have confidence in themselves, or a sense of trust. So he had this idea of the technique of mothering, and I think we don't just have to think of women conducting that technique of mothering. I think it's absolutely the case that fathers also mother. So I think the technique of care is really what to think about here, and how that might be carried on or inform how you grow into later life. The Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, and this was built by Le Corbusier in 1947, well, not him physically, many others, designed by him. It took a very long project that took 5 years to construct. Don't know, some of you may have visited it. If you haven't, both these buildings, the Narcomfin and the Unité, would massively recommend to visit. They're in very different conditions, as you will see from the photos. The slab block of the Unité d'Habitation was designed by Le Corbusier, and it was built post-war in Marseille. A lot of Marseille had been destroyed by the German forces as they were trying to eject Jews and other resistant fighters, so they bombed the port, and then the Allied forces, when they claimed Marseille, also bombed the port, so it was in a very derelict condition, and this commission was part of rebuilding the port at that time, just after the Second World War. The Unité was, and is, 17 stories high, and it was designed to house 1,600 people in 23 different flat types. Its intricate section of interlocking two-storey apartments with double-height living spaces incorporated a rue intérieure every 3 floors. The Unité also included 26 different communal facilities, an internal street of shops that had a laundry, post office, pharmacy, barbers, hotel, restaurant and a health centre on the 7th and 8th floor, and then on the top floor, which is an exquisite space, a kindergarten and nursery with a roof garden, a pool for children and a gymnasium. The design draws on many different aspects of Corbusier's earlier work and research, both built projects and unbuilt. The vertical gardens that he looked at in a project called the Immeuble Villas from 1922, his famous 5-point plan of piloté, free facade, open plan, ribbon windows and roof garden that he developed through different villas in the 20s, and then his very large urban scale projects like La Vie Contemporaine from 1922 and La Vie Radieuse from 1935. Corbusier made visits in the mid to late 1920s to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, both for a commission he was working on but also to study the architecture. And he was inspired by a number of different aspects of the Narkomfin design, including its innovative section. So this is the section of the Narkomfin, the corridor you can see near the number 4, allowed you to access two different flats, each of which had a living space that was, well, not double, but a floor and a half high. And then on the lower floors, 1 and 2, to access flats that had 2-storey height living spaces. But the interlocking nature of the flats between 3, 4 and 5, which was quite inspiring to Corbusier at the time, and lots of different versions were tried by other constructivists. This isn't the only version of kind of interlocking flats. It was to keep the cost of the corridors low, but also to design corridors that allowed people to engage with each other and interact as social spaces. So the section of the Unité is, I think, a really beautiful section with this corridor in the centre, and then you have 2 flats that overlap, one that goes from lower to higher. They're both accessed from the corridor, and one that starts on the corridor level and then wraps underneath. So both flats across the section of the building have views out to both sides of the building, as well as these double height living spaces. This is an interior of the Narkomfin, slightly less elegant staircase than in the Unité. And then this is a view through one of the flats in the Unité, looking out to the balcony. This is the Narkomfin corridor in its current state. Well, this is a couple of years ago. It's even worse now. And this is a corridor, an external corridor in the Unité. And then this is the roof of the Narkomfin, although that's now got someone I know visited last summer, and it's got a yoga space and cafe on the roof now, but I'm not sure how structurally sound it is. And then this is the roof space of the Unité. But at the same time as Corb being inspired by the Narkomfin features, Ginsberg and the other constructivists had also read articles by Corb. They knew about Corb's 5-point plan, and those are evident in the Narkomfin as well, particularly in the Narkomfin, the use of piloté and the innovative use of the roof, which comes actually from Corb. So there's a very, very interesting creative overlap between the 2 schemes in terms of these borrowings of innovative architectural design features, one from the other. But I think just to think of them as formal or aesthetic forms of borrowing is a bit of a distraction from what were quite important tensions that existed between Le Corbusier and Ginsberg's architectural intentions, defined in terms of their political positions. So Both Ginsberg and Le Corbusier were advocates of the machine for living. But if for Le Corbusier, technology's role was to support capitalism, to make it more efficient and more rational, for the Russian constructivists, the radicalization of architecture through new industrialized forms and processes was celebrated in order to develop the newly formed Bolshevik state based on socialist principles. So for Ginsberg, at least in 1928, architecture could provoke revolution. For Corbusier, architecture's purpose was to take the place of revolution. And he writes, architecture or revolution can be avoided. But it's actually, the Corb's thinking around the relation of architecture and revolution is actually more complicated than that, and I've been doing more work on that since. And as someone who's written a lot about this, who I would recommend to you if you're interested, is the American architectural historian Mary McLeod. It's certainly the case that Corbusier was not a revolutionary, but he did have revolutionary ideas for architecture. May morn. So you start to see these elements repeating themselves in the talk now. A spacious one-bedroom flat located on the 8th floor, commanding marvellous views of communal gardens and the city beyond. The property is located in a Grade 2 listed ex-local authority block, with 2 newly installed lifts giving easy access to the shopping, restaurants and transport facilities of Bayswater, Circle and District lines, and Queensway, Central line, plus overground routes of Paddington. Magnificent Kensington Gardens are close by. This property consists of 2 double bedrooms and offers spacious living conditions. The property is situated on the 3rd floor and is in very good condition. The flat would be ideal for a first-time buyer or a rental investment. It also benefits from being close to Roehampton University and local amenities. A well-presented, bright, one-bedroom flat on the 6th floor of this Grade 2 listed modern block of flats serviced by 2 lifts. This ex-council flat benefits from spacious rooms and communal gardens. The property is offered in good decorative order throughout, further benefiting from being chain-free. The property is ideally located for the shopping, entertainment and public transport facilities of Queensway, Lancaster Gate and Paddington. A practical 3-bedroom flat, split over 2 levels on the upper level of this small block in Churchill Gardens. The property consists of 2 double and 1 single bedroom, kitchen, reception room, bathroom, separate WC and a large balcony. The property requires updating but gives potential buyers the chance to put their own stamp on the property. An unmodernised 2-bedroom flat set on the 1st floor lift of this block on the superbly located Hallfield Estate, Westminster Council in Bayswater, occupying approximately 68 square metres. The property comprises 2 double bedrooms, reception room, generously sized kitchen, bathroom and separate WC, and once refurbished would make an excellent central London home or long-term rental investment. Another great located flat for sale. It's not actually true, but anyway, we know estate agents. The property offers a well-proportioned 1-bedroom flat located on the 8th floor with great views, and this is my personal favourite. Don't worry about the mortgage. Most high street land banks will lend due to its excellent location. We'll come back to what's happening to those estates in a little while. The setting. So this is the sort of 3rd strand now of the psychoanalytic weave, and the setting is also known as a generalised triangular structure with variable thirds. Okay, didn't like that image, that's a shame. Okay, not to worry. It's quite a nice image of a triangular diagram of the setting drawn by Andre Green. So maybe in your mind, imagine a triangle drawn in black on a white background. In psychoanalytic theory, the main conditions of treatment following Sigmund Freud include arrangements about time and money, as well as certain ceremonials governing the physical positions of the analysand who lies down on a couch and speaks, and the analyst who sits behind on a chair and listens. Well, that hasn't quite panned out in this room. You haven't had much of a chance to speak. Maybe you will shortly. Freud's rules for the spatial positions of the analytic setting were also derived from a personal motive. He didn't want to be stared at for long periods of time, but also from a professional concern, to avoid giving the patient material for interpretation, i.e. for the patient to look at Freud's face and see whether he's kind of frowning or smiling, because we pick up so many different signals from just facial expression. In a discussion of Freud's method, Winnicott distinguishes the technique from the setting in which the work is carried out. So one thing is the speaking and listening, the technique, and the other is the physical setting of the work. Andre Green has considered this setting a homologue, so something similar to what he calls the third element in analysis, the analytic object, which in his view corresponds precisely to Winnicott's definition of the transitional object and is formed through the analytic association between analyst and analysand. So kind of simply put, his idea is that the transitional object, which is this transitional space formed between two people, mother and child in Winnicott's work, can be understood architecturally. So we could think of the physical space in which analysis takes place between the analyst and the analysand as a transitional setting in some senses. And he thinks of this, as you can see, very spatially here. The analytic object is neither internal to the analyst or analysand, nor external to either one or the other, and is situated between two. So it corresponds precisely to Winnicott's definition of the transitional object and its location in the intermediate area of potential space, the space of overlap demarcated by the setting. And so finally, the third architectural structure I want to look at is Alton West in Roehampton, London, SW15, that was built between 1954 and 58. And these are intentionally like that, because I'm interested in the transitional space between the viewer and the photograph. That space that we kind of collapse when we're looking at a fully a clear image. We forget that we're looking at a construction. The Alton West estate consisted of around 70 acres of housing and around 1,900 dwellings located in 100 acres of parkland. The dwellings were divided into 5 different types: 12-storey point blocks, 11-storey slab blocks, so like the Unité, 4-storey slab blocks of maisonettes, and then terraces of single-storey housing for old people, as well as 2-storey terracing. The tall blocks were located in clusters of point blocks and slab blocks, with the lower buildings distributed between them. And there were also community facilities in the form of schools, surgery, shops and a library. The architectural historian Nicholas Bullock has outlined how Corb's Unité was a point of reference for the architects of the London County Council in the 50s, and while the architects of Alton East at Roehampton were advocates of new humanism, those of Alton West were pro-Corbu. I'm not going to go into massive detail here, but it's a very large project that had 2 phases. The early phase, called Alton East, was influenced by Swedish welfare architecture and included these high-rises that are known as point blocks and low-rises with terraced roofs, with pitched roofs, and they were brick-clad. And the second phase, which was influenced by the Unité, consisted of these slab blocks that were direct references to the Unité, and flat-roofed lower structures, and concrete-clad rather than brick-clad point blocks. Nicholas Bullock notes that in the translation of ideas from the Unité in Marseille to Alton West in Roehampton, a number of key design features were lost, including the communal spaces, the double-height living rooms, and the central access corridor. Yeah, quite a lot really. It was for economic reasons that the English access balcony replaced the rue intérieure. So you can just see from this plan that you don't have an interior corridor. You basically have, you have an access gallery, and then you have flats that are all, they're maisonettes, so they're 2-storey, but there are no rooms that are 2-storey. Sorry, I should have also shown you a section here. A loss in translation was also registered in terms of the reduction of the shared facilities, including no roof garden, and a key criticism made of the scheme at the time was that the separation of different dwelling types into different buildings produced a lack of coherent structure at a community level. So I've just been reading today, actually, an article from 1951 where the architects who designed this structure had just come back from visiting Corbusier's Unité, and they're discussing all the different design features, what works about the interior corridor, what doesn't. And I think, you know, it was a very, very interesting process that they had to go through to try and translate what they really respected and admired in the Unité into London County Council architecture with a reduced budget and a different kind of brief. And this is the final section, so we're almost there. For those of you who want more tea or to go to the pub, leave it open there. Moss Green. My first visit to the house I came to call Moss Green had occurred in the spring of 2001, and for the next decade I was to walk past Moss Green several times a year as part of my weekly Sunday walk. In our walks out of Sevenoaks, we sometimes take the route down Oak Lane, then Grassy Lane, past Fig Street, and along Gracious Lane, drawing to the halt at the fork in the road where Moss Green is situated. When we first saw the house, we were entirely enchanted with the way of life it represented, as well as the arresting beauty of its slow yet gentle decay. The house was single-storey, of a timber and brick construction, and placed at the top of a scarp slope with its porch facing out with a view of southern England, under which 2 benches faced one another. The interior was full of exquisite touches: a perfectly placed built-in cupboard, a carefully detailed windowsill and frame, a thoughtful light switch, a door handle that fitted like a glove. It was hovering at that point where the decay was still able to provide an atmosphere of charm, where the thought of collapse could be held off, and where it was still possible to imagine oneself into the house, repairing the woodwork and occupying the rooms. We guessed it had probably been built after the First World War, and perhaps as part of a programme called Homes Fit for Heroes, which allowed returning and often traumatised soldiers to readjust to civilian life in the comfort of a simple domestic setting, with space for gardening and growing food. But over the years, the house has increasingly fallen into disrepair, and our spirits now sink each time we see it. When its slate roof was removed around 3 years ago, the rot really set in, and as a structure now, it's barely savable. As it slipped past the threshold of being savable, we have surrendered our dream of living there ourselves in a modest rural retreat. Though actually to have bought land like that in Sevenoaks, you probably need $1 million, but let's not worry too much about that. No doubt the owner is waiting for the moment of collapse, when the walls cave in order to construct a dwelling which requires no restorative work. I wonder whether Moss Green should have been listed, and whether I should have taken on that task myself. And if it's not valued as a piece of architectural heritage, what are those emotional qualities it holds that make it feel special enough to want to save? On a visit several years ago, when the house was open to the elements but some of its contents still present, we noted books on architecture, old journals from the building trade, and piles of photographs. We salvaged a few items, notably one book, New Architecture of London, a selection of buildings since 1930, along with a selection of black and white photographs, some of which I've shown you today. Recently, in examining the photographs salvaged from Moss Green more closely, I've become fascinated with tracking down the images for the buildings imaged in them. As well as the architectural qualities of the structures, I had 5 text-based clues to work with. a board in front of one of the flats with the name Ernest Nifton Limited, a car parked outside another with a registration plate SLX 596, a street sign, which is this one here, which under a magnifying glass you can read Westmoreland Terrace, letters over the entrance to two other buildings with the words 124 Edmund Street and WITL, which you can just see tucked in here on the right. In working with these clues and new architecture of London, I've managed to track down most of the structures, and it turns out that the majority we now regard as modernist icons, such as the Horfield Estate, designed by Tecklin, Drake and Lasdon for Paddington Borough Council in 1952-5. Roehampton, designed by the London County Council Architects Department, with Alton East from 52 to 55 and Alton West from 55 to 59. Churchill Gardens from 1950 to 1962, designed by Powell and Moyer for Westminster City Council. And then the Elmington Estate, 1957 on Picton Street, London in Camberwell, designed by the London County Council Architects Department. At the same time, I was searching for a new flat of my own in London to live in and buy, and so I took the opportunity to view these buildings via primelocation.com. Some of you may know it, some of you probably don't. It's a property website. The search revealed their value in economic terms as property, as commodities. From an estate agent's perspective, these flats are described as ideal investments, not really as places where the purchaser might choose to live, but as rather as buy-to-let opportunities, real estate to be rented out to students and others, and that's particularly the case with the Roehampton one, because of Roehampton University being next door. The images of fully occupied domestic settings on the property website provide a rather interesting counterbalance to the just completed exteriors photographed on the outside, positioning architecture as a commodity to be purchased by individuals as well as, or perhaps instead of, social entities to be lived in by communities. Searching for modernist icons through primelocation.com has become a rather stark reminder of what's happened to the socialist ideals of modernism. They weren't really, in England, revolutionary ideals, but the welfare state was reformist and certainly imagined that people of different classes could mix together in these estates. So I went back and re-photographed the estates to try and match the originals. Some of the modern movement's public housing projects have become oases of cool property in the London postcodes associated with the rich. So here's the Horfield estate. And what you notice immediately is that the trees are now bigger than the building, which wasn't the case at the start. Those in the west, this is Churchill Gardens, have often been quite well maintained and sometimes privatised, provided with concierge schemes. Others in areas of regeneration have been connected with the aspirations of up-and-coming neighbourhoods. The somewhat grimy conditions of their neglected public spaces, the lifts, stairways and facades, overlooked by purchasers keen to be part of lifestyles often by certain parts of London. Those pieces of modern architecture in the poorer boroughs, outside the pockets of existing wealth in the inspiring regeneration zones, have been allowed to decline materially, often not included in the council's major works programmes, which do the large-scale repair and maintenance. Often located in what are called sink estates, many of the blocks house the poorest families in London, and some have been demolished. This is the Elmington estate, just before it was demolished, because the years of neglect have led to conditions of terminal dereliction, or because the original construction is viewed to be too expensive to overhaul. Well, this whole area, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but I've recently been tracking what's happened in the last even 3 years to each of these estates. Anything that was social housing in the Elmington estate's been removed, so tenants were basically evicted. Some have been rehoused, not all. Roehampton's just about to go through regeneration. It's unclear how many social housing units will stay, probably very few. Churchill Gardens has been partly privatised. They're going to remove some of the communal facilities. And in the Horfield estate, the people who are the leaseholders are having to pay massive, massive sums for the decoration of the buildings. It's a complex area, but I think these are really interesting examples of different stories across London of what's happening to social housing. But what of the person who lived in Moss Green and owned once those photographs of these modern buildings? Was he or she an architect? Did they play a role in designing the buildings in the photographs? How did they compare the schemes for urban mass housing with their own rural bungalow? If the delicate beauty of Moss Green points outwards to a whole network of modernist icons, how can one compare these two different modernisms, the earlier vernacular craft-based phase of the arts and crafts and the later phase of industrialisation and standardisation? From Tacitus Dean's work critiquing the heroism of modernism by pointing to the failure of certain technological schemes, and this is her sound mirrors from 99, a kind of failed scheme that was meant to pick up sounds from across the channel, to Rutley's Luxembourg's glowing photographs of North London's high-rise flats in a piece called Caliban Towers from her book London, a Modern Project, which titles Modernist Architecture, a Monster, Caliban's a Monster. There's been a recent fascination with the so-called failure of the modern project. In some cases, this takes a form of wistful melancholy for modernism's passing, at other times a more gleeful delight at the collapse of the social dream, that some people think was incredibly forceful and others ridiculously idealistic. I'm just going to skip this little section because we're short on time. Sorry, oh, seems to have missed some
No, it's
slides.
doing the wrong one.
Oh, it's because it's a large image. Oh, okay. Maybe we just go to the, if someone can just,
If you go
yeah,
back to the
where's the
next two.
It's okay. Okay, for some reason it's not picked up. I don't know. I have no idea. It's not translated across. Okay, well, not to worry. It's not essential to see this. Okay, I'm just going to end with a slight kind of epilogue. Let's have this slide will do. Returning to Moss Green once again several weekends ago, much of the timber work had collapsed and was lying in pieces all over the grass. I turned over one rotten section to reveal two words painted in fast fragmenting white letters: May Morn. This, I remembered, was the building's name plaque, which had been located at the entrance to the plot, framed by brambles when we first came across the house. Morn and morn are homonyms. One suggests a beginning, the other an ending. Morn, as in morning, begins the day, while mourning, with a U, in grieving the loss of something or someone, marks an ending. The Moss Green house, the paper of the photographs, the painted letters May Morn, all three point towards their own disintegration, their endings. And yet the buildings contained within the photographs are shown at the beginning of their life. What does it mean now to turn back and examine these icons of modernism at an early moment, a springtime, a May morn, when hope for a better future was not viewed as a naively misjudged optimism? I wrote the first version of May Morn on a morning in May, a day before the general election of the 6th of May 2010 in the United Kingdom, and I delivered it as a talk 6 days later, after I'd voted Liberal for the first time in my life. So disgusted was I with New Labour's lies over the Iraq War. On a day, the coalition between the Liberals and Tories was formed, and on a day on which I discovered I'd helped to deliver the country a Tory government. That was a cheery moment. A bright doctoral student, Justin Hunt, approached me after my talk and asked, "Did you know there were 2 homonyms in the title of your talk, not 1? I looked back rather blankly. May the month and May the verb, he explained, and then added, "You seem to be asking for a right to mourn." It turns out that May is a homograph, not a homonym. May is a month of the year, but May is also a modal verb, one which is used to request permission. May I mourn? As I now experience the demolition of the public sector instigated by the UK's condemned government, potentially the end of that modern project of which these housing schemes are a key part, this essay's fragile sense of hope starts to feel rather inappropriate for the times. Is a nostalgia for modernist housing which turns back to an idealised moment in order to seek inspiration for a better future appropriate as a gesture? Writing positively of nostalgia as a longing for something better, Frederick Jameson has pointed out, with reference to the earlier work of Walter Benjamin on allegory and ruin, that turning back to a past, because it appears to be better than the problems of the present, is not necessarily regressive, especially if it can be used to change the future. He writes, "If nostalgia as a political motivation is most frequently associated with fascism, there's no reason why a nostalgia that's conscious of itself, a lucid and remorseless dissatisfaction with the present on the grounds of some remembered plenitude, cannot furnish as adequate a revolutionary stimulus as any other." And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you,
How are you
Jane.
doing? Shall I come to the front maybe? Or are you happy to turn and ask what makes sense?
You could come.
Yeah, maybe that makes more sense.
So do we have questions for Jane about any part of writing? Or issues that she's raising with her writing, or anything that you found probably quite interesting, since your generation can't remember. Well, some of us can't remember, either not being here, the history of public housing in our life as such. But as a history, we do know about it. So, what do you think?
Well, I think it's also, it's not only, I mean, the housing is one part of it,
Yes.
but I guess the other part is the universities, which were, set up as public universities, so they were to be free, you wouldn't have to pay fees, and the national health system was also part of it, so free education, free housing, free medical services, all of which are being eroded as we speak now. I mean, some of you may come from countries where there isn't that kind of sense of public sector welfare state, but then others may come from countries where it's in a much more healthy condition. I mean, so you have different experiences of how that works, and whether you've benefited from it or whether you feel you've never really known it. Yeah.
It seems like all those organizations require quite a big state support, including the housing, whilst flats there are relatively cheap and quite easy to maintain. But then again, it relies on this massive state funding, state maintenance, state support as an organization. And would you say that this is a design failure here, that relies too much on external pieces?
No, I wouldn't. I'd say the failure is in the political process, because if you think, I mean, I don't know whether many of you are working and whether you pay taxes, but one of the kind of interesting things is the amount of tax that people pay in the UK has not gone down, it's gone up. And yet the services that are provided through the tax. I have absolutely no problem paying tax. I'd happily pay 50% tax if there were services provided through it. So I think there's a strange thing that's happened in UK politics where taxes remain the same and taxes are there to provide the state with money to spend, and yet less and less things are being provided by the state. What tends to happen is the taxes are used to subsidise private companies who themselves don't actually have to pay tax in these public-private initiatives. I think in some cases there are problems with the design. You know, I think there's a kind of slight disappointment with certain aspects of Roehampton when you look at the Unity and how that kind of played out. But I think one of the main problems has been the lack of maintenance, which is actually a very, very particular strategy that they're adopting in South London at the moment, which they adopted on the Haygate, which is a massive housing estate in South London, and the Aylesbury, which is currently being demolished. And what Southwark Council did with both those estates is chose not to maintain them for 20 years, so that they were so run down that they could then give the argument that the only solution was to demolish them. And actually new reports have come out. A colleague of mine at UCL has just written a brilliant report on whether you should demolish or whether you should refurbish and what the different costs are. And what's never ever taken into account with refurbishment, with demolition, is the psychological implications. I just read an article last night about, I think they were like a group of pensioners, so people in their 70s who own their own flats in Aylesbury, who have now been evicted, and some of them have had heart attacks and depression and died much younger because of it. So I think there are also these kind of hidden costs. So one way, I suppose, of assessing it is to do with economics. Another way would be social. Another way would be aesthetics and design. So maybe it's even helpful to kind of try and pull those out, and then maybe to compare them to similar kinds of blocks in other countries. I mean, the point blocks were influenced by Swedish design and the Swedish welfare state. And actually, I've got some students working with me at the moment from Copenhagen. And what the government does there is it's never allowed to demolish. It always has to refurbish. And that could cause equally some problems where some estates that aren't that great end up being kept when perhaps they should be taken down and replaced with a better design. But I think it's a much more enlightened kind of policy most of the time, because it means that people aren't evicted from their homes. So I think the comparisons globally are very, very interesting. Also, of course, into Turkey, South America. There's a lot of, I mean, housing was really popular as a subject in architecture. The architectural department in the LCC was 3,000 people, and they really wanted to work with the council. That was where the innovations took place then. And it was a really popular topic in universities in the sort of 70s. It's become really unpopular. Certainly when I was studying, I studied at Sheffield, housing did come up. I actually really enjoyed it, but I know it wasn't a big popular topic. But I don't know whether you've do housing groups here now. I know quite a few universities are really sort of starting that. It seems to be back on the agenda just because it affects everyone.
Do we have any other questions?
I've got one. I thought there was quite a lot of importance throughout your presentation about the image and kind of like the image relationship to the modernism movement, and when you had all the photographs, as like Colomina talks about. But when you then showed like the prime location and how there's no kind of interpretation, and it's a completely different view of like how to live in them. Like the modernist movement was that there's no cars, there's no people. You know, they like certain architects like to portray it in like the images you showed, just as like an object almost. But then the different relationship to how we now show them. What are your feelings on that? Like with like the prime location, how they show that and sell it almost.
Well, I suppose I think that all images are constructions. So I suppose what I'm trying to do, it's not always. I have different strategies for how to use images to kind of show their constructive nature, and I don't know how that comes across. So I try not to. Generally, I try not to use them as illustrations, but as a kind of parallel text. But I thought for today, because you probably didn't know some of those buildings, it was helpful to have the sections and more explanatory images, but in the book there won't be explanatory images. The images are used as evocations in a way. So I suppose that's why the image that where you can't see the building hopefully then sets the tone for the reading of the other one, so that when you look at the prime location one, you kind of realise it's being set up for a certain purpose.
Yeah.
But what's your thought? It's an interesting question.
I'm not really sure. I think we just reinterpret it in different ways, and I think that's the interesting part.
Yeah.
How different people, like when you were talking about the images first of all, and then you talked about them in a different way, like you're an estate agent selling them, how you almost interpret the image differently. So I think it's open up to almost the individual and how much they know about the subject, how they interpret it.
That's right. I mean, I think there's also that thing, one of our master's students did his dissertation last year on the proliferation of iconic buildings through Flickr and these other sites that aren't, that it's a different kind of authorship. So I suppose with prime location, they don't see, as you're saying, they don't see them, they're not controlling the image aesthetically, but they are controlling it in terms of wanting to allow you to project yourself into those spaces. And I think you hardly ever see an ex-council flat when it's sold. You very rarely see the exterior, because I think they don't feel that that's where you will, when you see the exterior, you'll probably kind of panic and assume that it's falling apart, and that might not be a very good investment. So they tend to just show the interior. But I mean, I was thinking you could almost construct this whole talk using images, actually. Yeah, Emma.
I mean, I was going to raise it sort of related. Thank you very much for a lovely talk. But I was interested in the relationship between the image and the text, and the way that you construct these kind of, is this written or textual narrative, verbal narrative, and then this sort of use of images. And I think this is the first time I've seen this talk where you actually tell us what we're seeing, because I've seen other iterations of it, where the text and the image seem to start to sort of flow against each other. I mean, I have never been clear in the past whether Moss Green is actually that house or it's another place. And I actually really like that ambiguity, which I think
without the explanation.
Because I think it's quite. I mean, you could do the talk with just images, but actually one of the things about the lost object and I don't know so much about the transitional object, but presumably is that it's not necessarily a visual thing, and that we're kind of trying to pin it down to being a visual thing, and architectural criticism becomes very much kind of criticism of the visual, the look of it, and it's played through its idea of property as well. The image of property is the image, not the other experiences of it. So
that's right.
The image. Say more about
lots. I'm trying to think of which. I suppose what I'm thinking of, it works differently for a talk and for the book, and because I'm trying to finish the book right now. What I'm looking at in the book is thinking of the transitional object as the space between. You'll always see text and image, or reversed. It's not always text on the left, image on the right. So the book always has a strand of text and a strand of image, and they don't necessarily correspond. So I'm trying to think of the image, the transitional object is located almost within the gutter of the book, whereas I suppose in the spoken version, it's between what you hear and what you see. I mean, I've done another version of it where, when I speak the architectural part, I show the psychoanalytic diagrams. I don't know if you've seen that one. I don't know whether that's too much for people, because there's a lot going on. So you hear an architectural description, you see a psychoanalytic image, you hear a description of the transitional object by Winnicott, and you see a picture of the Narcontine. So trying to switch them. I think a lot of it depends. It's very difficult as the kind of author to think about the capacity of the reader. And I think readers are also very different. So sometimes you want things explained clearly, and other times you're quite happy to drift. And I suppose I'm trying to find a place where architectural history doesn't just explain, and where it allows you to drift a bit. But I think you're working against very, very strong reading conventions. I mean, one of the things that I'm doing in the book is I don't have any introduction, I just begin with the main lawn piece. And then at the very end there's some descriptions, but they're not that explanatory of what the method is. So I suppose for me it's just an ongoing project. I'm also constantly, like today when I was looking at the images again, I found now these exquisite archival images of the interiors of Roehampton in the 50s, the Unité in the 50s. I mean, they're not people photographing their own homes. They're, to an architectural audience to explain what a beautiful building this is. And Alconfin, exquisite images from the 20s and some from the 30s. So that's the whole thing of whether you should show an image in the contemporary moment and a text from an archival piece. I mean, I know this is something you've been exploring so much in your work. It just offers up so many possibilities in a way, and I think the controlling it is part of it. I kind of prefer it when it's much less explanatory, but I know sometimes people, especially in this kind of context, it can just be a bit baffling. I think the last time I gave it at the Bartlett, I could see people were quite baffled. Some people kind of got it, but others just didn't get it, and I thought it probably needs that explanatory layer. I don't know. Sorry, you were going to ask what
Sorry,
yeah. It's very interesting. You ended your talk with the arrival of the Conservative government, which is now pitching the Garden City as a new project, and your main lawn house with the porch and the bricks, and it's not that dissimilar of the traditional Garden City bungalows that were pitched at the turn of the last century. So there's a strange return to a much more conservative tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the kind of property developers that the councils are hiring to advise them on whether to demolish are, I mean, the one who advises Southwark, which is where I live, is completely anti. It's a diatribe against the point and slab block. So it's absolutely about the destruction of it. I think it's actually about the destruction of the welfare state ideologically by destroying the built structures themselves. And I mean, I suppose there's that other repeat, which is, and maybe this needs to come into it. Hopefully I won't still be writing the book in May. I'd like not to be. But if I am, maybe it needs some postscript, because we're coming up, this is how all books take, to the next election, which, well, let's not dwell on that today.
I was just wondering, when you were doing and this is the way how, as you're sort of putting the book together, you're probably thinking about it, that the transitional object presented in an explanatory diagram, or possibly visually, somehow didn't match to me the way that you showed your poetic picture of hanging the towel and having the little kind of, wash things. And I was just wondering if you... One of the photographs at the beginning, which was a kind of installation, and the installations you've done before. And I was just wondering if you're kind of starting the book with no introduction and kind of trying to create that space between, that the transitional object with children in particular is usually tactile. And in a way that the tactility of the page, or the in-between, or the change of material, which is also connected to, if I understood it well, from the side writing, is picking up the piece, turning it around, finding the name, or finding the kind of a smell or a color of the memory, so the name on a piece of wood or something. So perhaps the relationship between the image and the text, and equally beginning at the end, would impute the psychoanalytic element through the tactile.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
just
no,
a
for
sort
sure.
of
No, definitely.
suggestion that it's not. And
Yeah, no, it's
otherwise,
absolutely right.
I mean, it's quite difficult because the fabulous photographs and things and all the things you're talking about is like then, finding that kind of academic convention in which everything goes in. So
Well,
it's
it
just
is,
a question
no,
of
it's absolutely key. If this was, so I'm working with a graphic designer on the book. I'm yet to see quite how much free rein I have with the publisher. They seem at the moment, because it's my third book with them, finally they might be trusting me. It takes so much time. Which is nice though, that they're giving that scope. So at the moment, it's the 3 different sections are going to be on different paper stocks. And I'm sort of leaving that open to the designer to see how she wants to interpret the strands. The restriction is a budget in the sense of, not being able to have a really, really wide book, which is actually what she would really like to do. And I also want it to kind of be in a series with the other, the art and architecture, the site writing book, so it kind of comes with that. But yeah, if money were no object, as an artist's book, there are all kinds of
it
possibilities.
feels like more as an artist.
I know.
That's what I was thinking.
I know. These are such difficult questions to whether you go for a bespoke book, and also then you have much less words. So that's the other thing I've been trying to do is reduce the text. So there's not that much text, but there's more detail in the footnotes. But I think the tactility is really important. What I wanted was a very particular kind of binding, where instead of the book snapping shut, that binding where it just flops, so that you don't have to struggle to read across. It's just open on the page. But yeah, there's a whole physical design process that's going to be the next phase. But I absolutely take your point, and I want some of the pages to be kind of dry. And maybe the black and white images to have that kind of varnish on them, so the page is dry with the image kind of glossy, and then some of the images very on glossy paper and others on very thin kind of see-through paper. We'll see.
Interesting to know that with a book such as this and a lecture such as this, especially at this particular point in the year, which is so heavily laden with the up-and-coming election, is whether you either have or have ever thought being comfortable with the idea of giving the lecture in a much more politicised arena rather than the safety of the architectural discussion, because it comes across as a really beautiful way, an interesting, unusual way in to talk about these very laden debates about housing. And to come in through both the personal but then hold the collective within that is kind of quite an interesting way to have that discussion opened up.
Yeah, no, it would be great to do that. I think it would make the work more active somehow. I did do a session in the Left Review of Books bookshop where I didn't do any explanation. I just read that very first bit, and it felt very, very different because I'm not determining any of the meaning at all. But what could be nice, I'm quite involved with the people on the Aylesbury at the moment because I live so near and seeing what they're going through. And there's some sessions that we might do together, so that might be a place to do the work. And obviously it means that the voice needs to change, and I think there are different registers in it. So some of it, I think, the autobiographical lends itself to that. The psychoanalytic, I think, is more difficult in that setting, and perhaps that strand doesn't need to be so strong. Depending on the setting, the weave could alter, I think. But yeah.
Any more questions? Well, I just want to say thank you. I'm sure you'll be thinking about this because all we all look thoughtful a bit. But any information you can find on Jane's website. I did forget to say that at the age of 32 she is a professor of architecture. Yes,
I like him.
So anyway, so I won't say how some of your nicknames because that has to be.
No, I hope not.
Anyway, the nice thing about this talk. It is very timely, and it will leave all of us who know something about the housing estates like that in any country to think about it. So thank you very much, Jane.
Yeah, thank you.